You're listening to the Knowledge Archives podcast. Welcome to the Knowledge Archives podcast. We're a group of students on a mission to learn from as many different disciplines of knowledge as possible. I'm your host, Madhav Malhotra, and today I'm glad to be joined by Charlotte Reemts, a research and monitoring ecologist at the Nature Conservancy in the US. Her research focuses on the field of restoration ecology, directly dealing with how we maintain the health of threatened ecosystems and species in the US. I'm looking forward to learning more about the status quo of this field and some of the challenges that it currently has. So thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I'm looking forward to learning more about your work. I thought to start off, it would be great to just hear a little bit about yourself and how you got involved with the area of restoration ecology, as well as some of the things you're working on right now at the Nature Conservancy.
Sounds good. So my name is Charlotte Reemts. I'm an ecologist and science project director with the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy is a global nonprofit, and our mission is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. So we're out there trying to save the world. I came to the Nature Conservancy sort of through a little bit of a winding path. When I finished my undergraduate work, I had majored in biology. I was very interested in science. I knew I liked being outdoors, but I really didn't know what I wanted to do. So I moved in with a friend of mine from college, and I worked in a public garden for a while because I had really enjoyed gardening as a kid. And I was really interested in how people can use public gardens like that as an educational tool. So anybody who's done any gardening knows that most of gardening is weeding. People get all excited about planting new things and picking flowers, but it's really all about weeding. And so after several months of this, I decided that if I was going to spend my life weeding, I wanted to do it in places that mattered more. And so I went back to graduate school and I got a master's degree in plant ecology. And my goal was really to work in natural areas and help improve the management of natural areas so that we can save as many species in the world as we can. And the Nature Conservancy is a really great place to do that. So I've been working in Texas for over 15 years at this point. I get to work statewide. Texas is a very diverse state ecologically. So as a scientist, it's a fascinating place to work because I get to work in deserts and grasslands and woodlands and coastal systems, and they're all different, but they're also all related. So my job is to help manage these systems as best we can and also understand how we can manage the systems in a way that's going to scale up and make a bigger impact.
And I think when it comes to this area, we in the public, we always hear about ecological conservation through fundraisers, through charities, but people aren't as much familiar with how it's actually done. So I'd love to just start off by thinking about just on the ground, the experiences that you must go through when trying to manage ecosystems sustainably, and start that off with identifying the problem. So how do we figure out when there are key ecosystems or key species that are being threatened, and what are the different types of factors that we have to consider to figure out, well, where is the intervention most needed?
That is an excellent question, and that is a whole field of science called spatial decision making. But the way that it usually works on the ground is we know that there are some species that are more common than others. And so we'll tend to start looking at the species that are less common and try to understand why they're less common. So some things are just very rare because they live in very specialized habitats. So there's not a lot of habitat. There's just not a lot of space for those species. And as long as the habitat's protected, it's okay for those species to be rare. They'll persist in those rare habitats. There are other species that are rare because of some kind of disturbance or intervention. So that could be habitat destruction through conversion of land for agriculture or development. It could be invasive species problems. Increasingly, there are a lot of species that are being threatened by climate change. And so sometimes even for those really common species, if we can see that their population trajectory is headed downwards, so there's still a lot of them, but every year there's fewer, those are species that we really need to look at. And you can do the same thing for habitats or ecosystems. So prairies or grasslands are one of the most threatened ecosystems worldwide because they have these lovely, deep, dark, rich soils that are incredible for growing crops. And so worldwide, many, many of our prairies have been converted to agricultural fields. That's how we're feeding the world population. But that also means that there's very few of those prairies left. And so we really need to focus on preserving the ones that we have, and in cases where we can, restoring additional prairies. One other way to look at which ecosystems we need to manage or conserve or restore is the benefits that they bring for us as humans. So you can think about something like oyster reefs. They produce food that we eat, so they're important economically. But depending on where an oyster reef is placed, it can also protect a shoreline from hurricanes or other storms. And so we can focus on restoring oyster reefs, both for the economic impact, because they're important ecologically, and also because they provide some human protection. And there's a whole group of restoration activities or conservation activities that we call natural climate solutions. And these are things that either protect carbon that is already stored or help draw additional carbon out of the atmosphere. So you can think about things like protecting a forest from getting cut down or burned down. You can restore a forest so the growing trees pull more carbon. You can do similar things with prairies. Like I said, prairies have very deep, rich soils, and they hold a lot of carbon in the soil. And when you disturb that soil through plowing it, a lot of the carbon gets released to the air very, very quickly, on the order of a couple of years. We know that we can take crop fields and restore them back to prairie, and we can get maybe half or so of the carbon back in the first few decades. And so restoring prairies helps us with carbon sequestration, but protecting the prairies that we have left helps even more because it takes centuries to get all of the carbon back. So those are all the different things that an organization like the Nature Conservancy thinks about when we try to decide where we work. And it's always a balancing act. You know, is it more important to work in this prairie or protect this other habitat for a rare species? And we have, everybody has limited funds. So we're always trying to balance where we think we can make the biggest impact.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure it's a hugely complicated field in and of itself to figure out the areas to prioritize. Recently, we were talking to an ecological economist, and that was just his job. It was just his job to figure out which ecosystem services to prioritize. I really respect the people that kind of do this baseline work, so then ecologists like you can go out on the field and start to do some of the work in actually implementing the solutions. And when it comes to those, just looking at your research papers, there are a bunch of ways to deal with individual invasive species. There are a bunch of ways to deal with promoting the health of ecosystems as a whole. When we think about areas like Texas, based on the individual problems that arise in ecosystems in Texas, what are some of the most common solutions that we're going to need to address things like the types of invasive species that we find here, or the types of challenges that we see from human activity, etc.?
So a place like Texas, the landscape for a very long time has been shaped by fire. And some of that fire was from natural lightning strikes, and a lot of the fire was from the various indigenous native communities that used fire for many, many different purposes. They used it to clear areas for them to travel through. They knew that bison and other grazing animals will preferentially eat young grass. So if you burn an area, wait a couple weeks for the grass to resprout, that attracts grazing animals that they could then hunt. And they also had really deep understanding of how certain food crops, so the berries or the roots, would respond to fire in different seasons. And so through millennia of these landscapes being shaped by fire, we have all of these species that are adapted to certain kinds of fire and certain intervals of fire. And ecologically, we call that a fire regime. So you can think of something like a prairie probably burned every 3 to 5-ish years, probably quite often if it was a lightning strike, it was probably happening in late summer because that's when it's very dry. Native American fire, obviously, that could have happened at any time of year. But these species are adapted to having the fire come through, burning off all the above ground vegetation. So they store everything that's important underground. Then you have systems like in East Texas and much of the southeastern US, you have the longleaf pine system, which is essentially a prairie with pine trees in it. And it burned very much the same way, that it was very low intensity fires. Flames are short, they don't cause a lot of damage. They're basically just burning things off the surface. We have other ecosystems that have more of a high severity or mixed severity fire regime. So that is where it's really hard to get a fire started. And so that means that fires only burn under really extreme conditions, when it's exceptionally hot and dry, and they will burn into the canopies of the trees. The fire will jump from one tree to the next, and it'll kill all the above ground vegetation. Those fires happen much less frequently, and so species have, over evolutionary history, sort of made these decisions about how they're going to adapt to fires. So some of them act just like the grasslands do. They keep everything that's important underground. When the fire comes through and the top gets burned off, they just resprout. There are other species who essentially, in an evolutionary way, say, well, it's so infrequent, I'm just going to live everything that's important above ground. If I get burned up, I don't resprout, I'm dead. But I'm going to count on the fact that there's enough other individuals of my species around that they'll either be in little pockets where the fire didn't burn, or there'll be some seed left. So because all of these landscapes were shaped by fire, prescribed fire is one of our most important management tools. And prescribed fire, some people call them controlled burns. We don't really control the fire. We just let it burn under conditions where it's going to do what we want it to do, and it'll stay within the boundaries that we set. So we'll do prescribed fires where we're trying to mimic whatever the natural fire regime was for an area. So for prairies, we'll try to burn roughly every 3 to 5 years. We try to vary what time of year we burn, because whenever you do a prescribed fire, there are some things that are going to be disadvantaged. There's some little animal that is above ground at that point. So you might think about insects that might have caterpillars above ground. Caterpillars are not particularly fireproof. So if a fire burns through there, that caterpillar's gone. At a different time of year, that same insect might have a little pupa that's underground. And that is very fireproof. Soil is an excellent insulator. So even if that little insect's only a couple inches or centimeters underneath the soil surface, that'll survive the fire. And then it emerges about the same time all the plants grow back, and then it's like, great, everything's new and fresh and green, and I'm happy. So by varying when we burn over the course of many years, we make sure that we're not always disadvantaging the same species. So fire is great, but there's also some limitations around using fire. So fire produces smoke, and if you have an area that you're trying to burn that's right next to a highway or in the middle of a residential neighborhood, those are much harder because managing the smoke becomes a problem. We don't want smoke blowing across the highway because then people can see and then you cause car accidents, and we don't need that. The other thing that's becoming trickier with prescribed fire is that as the climate is warming, the number of days that are suitable for prescribed fire are decreasing, because we try not to burn when it's very hot and dry. Those are the fires that will escape more easily and then cause damage that we don't want to cause. So we have other ways that we try to mimic the effects of fire. So you can use grazing in some ways that it doesn't exactly mimic fire. It helps remove biomass the same way fire does. Fire is very indiscriminate. It burns everything. Grazing animals are very picky, like just the same way we would walk up to a buffet and there's foods we like and foods we don't like. Grazing animals are the same way. There are plants that the ranchers call ice cream plants, because if that thing is in a field and the cattle get in there, that's the first thing that they'll eat. There's other things that the cattle really won't eat very much. And so over time, you can use grazing animals to adjust your species composition. In some cases, we'll actually use grazing animals to address invasive species. So if your invasive species is green at a time of the year that your native species are not, you can use the cattle to address that invasive species. Other ways that we can mimic fire is by mowing. So again, mowing is indiscriminate. It just removes all the above ground vegetation, but it's not exactly like fire because it doesn't release all of the nutrients that fire does. So grazing and mowing are two of the big ones, but then for some really specific purposes, we have other tools. So invasive species is one where unfortunately we have to use a lot of herbicide to deal with those species. You know, if you have an invasive grass that's green at the same time that all your native grasses are, you couldn't really address it with grazing. It might be very mowing tolerant. So mowing isn't going to disadvantage that invasive grass over your native grasses. And so then sometimes we do have to go in with very targeted amounts of herbicide to deal with those species. And then there's sort of all these other little fun things you can do. You know, we've been playing around with solarization, which is where you just put plastic across the plants that you don't want. It works well in some cases and not so well in others. That is a great technique for people to use on really small areas because it's pretty labor intensive. You know, you can't cover acres and acres with plastic. Although it is used in agriculture and you will get, you know, you've probably driven by some vegetable fields and you'll see sort of the rows are mounded and those mounds are covered with black plastic, and then you might have your strawberry plants or your tomato plants just growing out of it. Very effective at weed control. But in a natural system, we're not trying to control everything. We're just trying to target that one non-native plant. So you can do it when you have sort of patches of your invasive plant or monocultures where there's only the invasive plant. You can use solarization. Something else that we're experimenting with is using burn piles. So there are places where we need to cut down trees or shrubs because they're getting into the roads, or we're trying to maintain open grasslands. And so a common way to deal with that is to pile all of that cut material into a pile and then burn it. What happens is because those piles are big and they burn for a long time, you tend to end up with a bare patch in the ground. You're essentially sterilizing the soil. Like I said, soil is a very good insulator, but if you heat anything for long enough, that heat's going to penetrate deep enough that you're killing a lot of the seeds that are sitting in the soil. So we're trying to see if we can build those brush piles on purpose on top of the species that we don't want, burn them so that we kill all the living individuals and also all of the seeds, and then go back in with some native seeds and then restore it so that we've now gotten rid of the undesirable species and now we can put all the species we want back in there. We're pretty early on in that, so I don't know if it's going to work yet, but that's the hope for that one.
And when you start to consider these different approaches, and as you were saying before, notice the ways that the ecosystems are changing, for instance, due to climate change, and noticing how you're going to need to adjust one thing or another, have you seen any trends in the challenges that you see over time that now you have to say, wait a minute, we've been trying out this burning approach for such a long time, but now we're seeing these different results? How do you quantify, say, the effectiveness of the burn after a few years and then look back on the burns that you've done over decades?
Yeah, that is one of the tricks of land management, is that the conditions are different every year. And even without climate change, we have extremely wet years and extremely dry years, and we know that we get different results. Unfortunately, we don't always know when the very wet or the very dry years are coming. So sometimes you'll do something and then, you know, the next 2 years you're in drought and you're like, gosh, I wish I hadn't done that right before the drought. But the way that we try to evaluate it is by going back and measuring the things that we're trying to achieve. So if we are trying to have a prairie with the largest number of plant species possible, and particularly the largest number of prairie-specific species possible, we actually have to go back and count them. And so we'll go back and we'll survey these prairies. We'll look for all the prairie-specific species and then track them over time to see, are they increasing or decreasing, and are we achieving what we're trying to achieve? If you're looking at something like controlling an invasive species, it's the same thing. You have to go back and actually measure, are there more or fewer of them? And invasives, I mentioned climate change as being one of the things that's really challenging. Invasive species are also increasingly challenging because we're continually getting new species being introduced. Some of them are introduced by accident as weed contaminants, or you think a lot of the insects that are being introduced, they're coming over in potted plants, in nursery stock, in pallets. People don't mean to bring these species, but they show up anyway. And then there's other things that we introduce on purpose. We introduce things because we want to grow them in our gardens and we think they're pretty. And most garden plants stay in the garden where they belong, but some of them escape and start causing real problems. And so there's always these new species that we're having to deal with. And as soon as you kind of feel like you have one under control, often another one shows up. And the tricky thing is once you start getting multiple invasive species in an area, sometimes the things that you would do to control one actually benefits the other. And so then it becomes a lot harder. And that's where a lot of times we have to resort to the chemicals because they tend to be much more targeted. There's herbicides that will only kill grasses or only kill broadleaf plants or only kill certain broadleaf plants or certain grasses. And so by choosing those chemicals carefully and applying them judiciously, sometimes we can achieve what we're trying to do from a conservation perspective with much less work and more quickly than we could with other methods.
It seems like it's definitely a constant struggle with getting around nature's not evil whims. It's just what nature does. It's not how it's targeted against us, but it is hard work. And especially in the current climate, given the challenges of economic recessions with a pandemic, I'm sure your field work has been affected. And even right now in the US, it seems like environmental policy is less of a priority for current administration, given changes in funding, etc. What are some of the challenges that the Nature Conservancy and your own fieldwork is going through right now?
Yes, fieldwork has definitely been curtailed because of COVID, particularly early on when it was all new and we really didn't understand what to expect. I think to a large extent, we're definitely back out on the ground managing and collecting data. These natural areas sometimes are about the safest place that you can be because there's a lot of space to socially distance when you're on a 30,000 acre property. Often it's the travel to and from the sites that's the more dangerous part. Yeah, there's a lot of challenges, but there's also some opportunities right now. You've probably seen the pictures from around the world of when these shutdowns were implemented, how many places the air pollution just cleared up and people could see things, mountains off in the distance that they hadn't been able to see for decades. And so I see that as an opportunity because it shows people what we could accomplish. Obviously, a complete economic shutdown and lockdown is not the way that we want to handle air pollution. But it shows people what could be done if we change some other policies. And I think a lot of people also have a bigger appreciation for natural areas. And this doesn't mean like the national park or the wildlife reserves that are states and hours away. It means the little green spaces in your neighborhood where you can just go out and you can go sit and listen to the birds and watch the seasons change and just feel connected to the natural world around you. So really trying to look at where those natural spaces are and making sure that everybody has access to them because we know that they're not equally distributed around the city. And some of us have much more access to those than others. So using this new interest in natural spaces to try and make sure that everybody has a space that they can go to, I think it's a real window of opportunity for us right now. And even when national policy isn't always supporting environmental rules and issues in the way that we want to, there's a lot of really cool things happening at the local level. You think about all the mayors who've stepped up to say, my city is going to follow the Paris Accords and really creative uses of financing and taxes. So in Texas, we have an amazing example. So the city of San Antonio gets most of its water from an underground aquifer. And most of the water that the city uses enters the aquifer, a couple counties outside of the city. And the city recognized that if those natural areas in those counties got developed, that it would really affect their water quality and probably also how much water they have. And so the citizens of San Antonio have taxed themselves, and they use that tax money to protect natural areas where the water enters the aquifer. So that's called a water fund. They exist in various forms around the world. There's other water funds where people will pay to restore forests upstream, because without the forest, there's a lot of soil that washes into their drinking water, and it's very expensive to remove that. If you instead restore the forest, you not only get cleaner water, but you also get all these benefits for biodiversity. Carbon sequestration markets, you can go and buy carbon credits to offset, like if you want to go visit family on the other side of the country when it's safe to fly again, or if you just want to offset sort of the day-to-day emissions you do. Like I mentioned earlier, there's all these natural climate solutions that we can use carbon credits to pay for. So you can use carbon credits to restore forests, or to protect forests, or to protect prairies. And that's something that individuals can do. You don't have to wait for a policymaker. It would be great if all the policymakers would sign on to the Paris Accords and start to take climate change seriously. And ultimately, that's what we need. But in the meantime, there's a lot that we as individuals can do to contribute to it.
Yes, and I think it's great to finally focus on that last bit, what happens in the future. I know you were talking about some of the opportunities to come, and yes, this is a time where it's really important to nudge things in the right way, because there are also a bunch of challenges that we have to sort out as we get out of this economic recession and figure out how to keep on going sustainably in balancing economic and environmental needs. From my background in plastic pollution, one of the things that we see now is just more and more usage of disposable plastics, and that is not good, looking good for the oceans. And at the same time, when we consider that people are more scared of, say, using public transit, etc., there are some challenges that we need to figure out in making this go in the right direction. So my last question for you would be, when it comes to how we move forward in the field of restoration ecology, what are some of the areas that need the most attention going forward? And what are some of the largest unknowns that we still need more research on?
Wow, good questions. So some of the areas that I think are getting an increasing amount of attention is what we're calling urban ecology. So for a long time, biologists and ecologists, we would go study the really cool natural places. But more and more, we're realizing that there are a lot of species that can live in a city, and that there are ways that we can design our cities and our neighborhoods that help support even more species that are there already. So you look at things like having green spaces, using native plants in landscaping, having rain gardens that help capture rainwater and filter it a little bit so it's a little bit cleaner before it gets into the creeks. And then starting to understand that the benefits that green nature brings to a city. So having trees reduces heat, which in a place like Texas is extremely important. I mentioned earlier, in the Austin area, in the month of August, we only had 2 days with temperatures below 100 degrees. So you can imagine the difference that a little bit of shade can make to somebody who's standing at a bus stop waiting for the bus, or even just walking down the street going to visit their neighbor. It's much nicer to be walking down a shaded street than one where you're fully exposed to the sun. But there are challenges with things like growing trees in cities. It's hot, the soils are poor, there's a lot of pollution. And so there's still a lot of work to be done to figure out what are the best species to use, how do we get them to survive, where are the best places to put them. And then sort of all the interesting interactions you get, how do people respond to more nature in cities? We know that that brings a lot of mental health benefits, but are there ways that we can do this that bring even more benefits to other people? And then switching a little bit, I think one of the big unknowns in restoration ecology right now is the ground that we stand on. And I mean that quite literally. So all the soil. We've understood for a long time that certain restoration projects work better than others, and we think it's because of something that's happening in the soil. And we're starting to classify the things in the soil. So we know that there are different microbes that live in different places and different fungi and all these little soil invertebrates, but we don't really understand what they're all doing or how they're important or how we could, the same way that you can plant plants or seed plants to restore your prairie or your woodland, is there an equivalent that we can do with the soil? And I think once we understand that, that's really going to open up our restoration much more, because so often our restoration is limited because we're working on these very highly disturbed soils in urban areas or mine reclamation or old roads that are getting decommissioned. It's really hard to get things to grow there. And if we can figure out how to make the soils more hospitable to the plants, it'll make all of the rest of our restoration work much easier.
I think it's great to hear about some of these future directions that this very important field can head in, and it's just so much more increasingly urgent that we start to explore this and start to prioritize this. And I love that you were talking earlier about not just waiting for, say, policymakers or thinking about the larger perspective, but then actually thinking about what can each individual do, or if someone is even more passionate, what are the problems that still need to be solved, and how can someone who is passionate act on that. So I think that's a great note to wrap up on, and I really appreciated you taking the time to explain all of these details today.
Well, thank you. I have really enjoyed our conversation.
If anyone is curious to learn more about your work or the Nature Conservancy, where might they go?
So you can visit the Nature Conservancy's website, that's nature.org. And if you want to learn more about the things that you can do in your own backyard throughout the US at least, and I'm guessing in Canada also, there's native plant societies. And so that's a great place to learn about how do you make your little piece of the world more hospitable to native species. In the US, we also have a program called the Master Naturalists, where you can get together with other people and learn about the natural world. And that's a great way to understand all of these really cool interactions that are happening all around us much better.
I think that's great. I think if anyone is curious about that, then that would be a great resource to take action on. And I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to explain all of these insights and leave off that call to action at the end.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for inviting me.